Hi, and welcome back. We're talking about the Mongols here in our unit on ancient China. In part one, we spent a lot of time talking about Temujin, aka Genghis Khan. We looked at a lot of his skills, talked about some of his specific tactics, and how he took Beijing. In a lot of ways, we absolutely paralleled what we saw in the Genghis Khan video. So if you have not seen Genghis Khan Rise of a Conqueror, you definitely should check that out, because it so much gives us the visual of who Genghis Khan was. Now, Genghis Khan dies, though, and his empire continues. So in part two here, we're going to continue to talk about the Mongols, but we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, and his power that he takes in China. So let's go ahead here and look at that. Now, in part one, I talked about how after Genghis Khan died, the empire was split up into four different khanates. And you're not going to have to know the four different khanates, but I just want to show you the four here, the Kipchak Khanate, Ilkhanate, Chagatai Khanate, and the Great Khanate. And these are just four different regions of the Mongol Empire. And it's kind of smart that they did that, because ruling an empire that size is going to get very, very difficult when you're trying to bureaucratically run something. It's the same reason why we have 50 states here in America, because without that it would be a much more cumbersome empire to rule. So they split up into four different khanates. Continuing on a little bit about who the Mongols were, they rarely imposed their beliefs on conquered people. In fact, you saw this in the video. They actually imported a lot of Chinese knowledge, writing, which is something the Mongols did not do. They were illiterate. They could not read and write. So they brought in Chinese who could to write down a lot of the history of the Mongol people. They brought in Chinese medicine. They brought in Chinese warfare like gunpowder and things like that. So more often than not, you saw them adapting to the cultures they took rather than taking their culture and forcing it on the people they conquered, which is actually a pretty cool thing. They even adopted some of the culture of those they ruled. So I just kind of made that clear, especially with the Chinese, adopting Chinese warfare tactics, medicine, and writing. What you get out of this is a really cool time period that resembles something that we're going to talk about in Rome, something called the Pax Mongolica. The Pax Mongolica simply means Mongol peace. It's a time of peace and stability across the Mongol Empire from the mid-1200s to the mid-1300s. And it's really, when you look at any type of period in history, when one group has total control and they're willing to enforce their control, sometimes militarily or oftentimes by brutality like the Mongols did, you get peace out of that, surprisingly. People can travel safely because the Mongols have control. Nobody wants to mess with the Mongols. Nobody's going to come in and take their stuff, sack their cities, because it would be foolish to do so. So when the Mongols have that kind of control, the empire is actually pretty good. People can move about and travel safely. You're going to hear this same phrase in the Roman Empire when we get there later in this semester. And again, you have to remember, because Chinese history is so long, this is the 12 to 1300s. When we get to the Pax Romana, which took place really from 27 BC to 180 AD, that came way before this. So again, we're doing things a little bit out of order because Chinese history is so long. So that will make more sense when we get to Rome. The Pax Mongolica simply means Mongol peace, a time of peace and stability across the Mongol Empire. Trade and invention spread rapidly during the Pax Mongolica due to safe travel. So you have people who want to trade, you have people who want to move around, and that typically benefits most of your people. You'll see a lot of goods exchanging hands. It tends to be a prosperous time period because people feel safe traveling and trading. And that brings us to Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is going to be a unique ruler for the Mongols in that he's going to achieve something Genghis Khan never did, but at the same time, he's also going to be sort of a devastating ruler for the Mongols because his end will sort of signal the beginning of the end of the Mongols as well. So let's talk a little bit about Kublai Khan and how he rules as emperor. So Kublai Khan is the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he took the title of Great Khan in 1260. So, you do the math here, it's about 33 years after Genghis Khan dies. Now, he wanted to fulfill the wish of his grandfather, which was to conquer all of China. Genghis Khan wanted to do this. We saw this in the video. He never gets a chance to do so. He gets into northern China, conquers Beijing, but that's about it. Kublai Khan says, I'm going to go ahead and do this, and he does. And when he goes in and conquers China, he starts a new dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty. Yuan Dynasty ruled from 1279 to 1368 AD. So they're barely around for 100 years, and it is not a Chinese dynasty. This is a Mongol dynasty. The Chinese had never really had foreigners rule their country before. This is going to be kind of a first for them. So what's interesting, though, is because the Mongols come in and take total control, China was united for the first time in nearly 300 years. That's kind of significant because China has gone through its ups and its downs. We know about the dynastic cycle. We know about the rise and fall of dynasties. And when Kublai Khan comes in, there really hadn't been any stability in China for a couple of centuries. So in a way, he actually improves things. Kublai Khan's control opened China up for more trade and more foreign contact. One of the things the Chinese were not always open to is allowing foreigners to come in and trade, and he is going to do just that, which is interesting because he's going to see all this great stuff when he's in China, and that's not something the Mongols were used to having. The Mongols were not, people who had gold and silver, and not that the Chinese necessarily did either, but the Chinese had silk and porcelain and gunpowder and a lot of really good stuff. And I think, in a way, Kublai Khan's going to get pretty used to that and get very comfortable in that mode. So he definitely enjoyed living in luxury as the Chinese emperor. And I'm going to argue a little bit later that that's going to come back to bite him. Now, one of the things that Kublai Khan thinks he can do is take over Japan. So he attempted to take over Japan, but Japanese might and weather halted the invasion. When I say weather, a typhoon is what is recorded as doing most of the damage. Now, the Japanese put up a pretty good fight for those Mongols that they come in contact with, but ultimately when Kublai Khan tries to send a fleet of ships across the water over to take over Japan, a typhoon, which we would call in this part of the world a hurricane, comes through and takes out most of Kublai Khan's ships. So weather played a very, very big role here. That typhoon certainly played out in Japan's favor. Kublai Khan improved the Grand Canal and added 135 miles to it. We saw the Grand Canal in engineering and empire, which was started in the Sui dynasty. So Kublai Khan will add a little bit of mileage to that. So here is the Grand Canal right here. Everything you see in this brown color is the Yuan Dynasty, which is the land ruled by Kublai Khan and the Mongols. Japan's right over here, so he tried to sail his ships over to Japan, and that's when that typhoon took them out. And so you can see Japan is never conquered by the Mongols. A little bit more about Mongol rule in China. You have to understand, the Mongols were hugely outnumbered in China, and they actually lived apart from one another. And this sounds like segregation, and in a way it was, but it sort of worked. Because the Chinese were not allowed to hold high government office. They didn't want the Chinese to take their country back, but they still allowed the Chinese to have power in local levels. So they could serve at local levels. They gave the Chinese still some power. Just they kept the good jobs for the Mongols, which I think is a smart decision if you're the Mongols. Don't allow the Chinese any ability to maneuver themselves and take their country back. So high public office went to the Mongols, or it went to foreigners. The Mongols felt that foreigners could be trusted due to having no loyalties to the Mongols or the Chinese. So that was something that the Mongols and the Chinese definitely differed on. The Chinese really didn't want foreigners coming in and disrupting their culture. The Mongols absolutely invited them and encouraged foreigners to come in and trade. So with that, the Pax Mongolica extended trade, the Mongol peace. And we had talked about this on one of the previous slides. Because of this idea that foreigners were allowed, trade definitely improved under the Yuan dynasty, under the Mongols. So the things that traders came in and wanted, they wanted silk, they wanted porcelain, they wanted gunpowder, paper currency, and the compass. These were things that the Chinese were well known for, things that the Chinese invented or gave the world. So a lot of Europeans and a lot of other people wanted these goods because they could make a lot of money off them back home. So trading in Asia could give you a very high profit. Well, as we mentioned, they invited foreigners in, so they invited foreign merchants, and one of the most famous ones is Marco Polo. Marco Polo was a Venetian trader, which means he comes from Venice, Italy, and he came to Kublai Khan's court around 1275, and in a way he sort of becomes Kublai Khan's right-hand man because he can speak so many languages. Kublai Khan would not have been educated, would not have been able to speak different languages, but he recognized the need for that. So Marco Polo became very important in the Yuan Dynasty. So he worked for Kublai Khan because he had learned many Asian languages. But he goes back to Europe and he gets thrown in jail, and he starts telling people, now wait a minute, I've seen these wonderful things in China. China's got these awesome palaces and all this great stuff, and a lot of people who hadn't been traders in Europe didn't believe him. They thought the Chinese were savages. They thought they were backwards people. They didn't realize that the Chinese culture had been around for so long and had produced so many wonderful things. So a lot of people didn't believe Marco Polo's story. So he actually got thrown in prison, and there Polo told a story which was later published as a book, but most of the Europeans didn't believe it. They just didn't think that these things existed in China that he saw, even though we know very well today that his story was a very accurate telling of Chinese culture. So the end of Mongol rule in China. Well, Kublai Khan overspends himself. I think he gets used to being this emperor with a lot of power and a lot of money, and that works against him. So Kublai Khan's armies and navies suffered many humiliating defeats at a huge expense of lives and equipment toward the end of his reign. Anytime you have big armies, it costs a lot of money. You got to pay your soldiers, you got to feed your soldiers, you got to buy them equipment. It's a very costly endeavor. And when you lose, it's even more costly because, of course, you lose a lot of those supplies and you lose a lot of lives in the process. So Kublai Khan's armies and navies definitely started signaling the beginning of the end when they started losing towards the end of his reign. So heavy spending on wars, public works, and yuan luxuries overburdened the treasury and angered the overtaxed citizens. One of the things that we've seen a lot in China, and other places for that matter, is when you need money, you raise taxes. Well, here, if you're losing wars and you really like the luxuries of China, you're going to spend a lot of money on those things. And Kublai Khan did just that, and the citizens were getting very, very angry. And so when you overtax them, eventually they react, and that's exactly what's going to happen here. So Kublai Khan dies in 1294, and his successors really never kept the empire together. His successors were very inept at ruling the dynasty, and inept means they weren't very good at it. So the empire's crumbling kind of right before their eyes, and the Chinese are certainly seeing an opportunity to take their country back. So in 1368, Chinese rebels finally overthrew the Mongols. The Chinese were able to mount an attack and kick the Mongols out. And the Mongols were pretty weak at this point and couldn't stop it. So the Chinese were taking their country back for the Chinese. I mean, China wanted to be ruled by China again, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And they would establish a new dynasty called the Ming Dynasty. With the fall of the Yuan came the disintegration of the Mongol Empire in Asia. The Mongols didn't die out, but the empire did. So you still have Mongol people in Asia, you just wouldn't have the power base under the Mongol Empire like we saw under Genghis or Kublai Khan. And just to the east of this, Japan was on the rise. So that brings us to the end here, gang. We've seen the rise and fall of the Mongols, most of which started with Temujin. So we're going to go back to our question here that looks directly at him. So the question says, trace the development of Temujin and his empire, including background information, motivations, and military tactics used. And here we really want to parallel the Genghis Khan video that we saw yesterday. We want to talk about those tactics like organizing the clans of Mongolia, training them to be better fighters, using a meritocracy. That's a word I didn't use in part one, but we definitely saw that in the video. Meritocracy means modern army, where you promote people based on their merit, on their rank, rather than on their noble birth. So you know, the better the fighter, the better rank that they're going to have. He used tactics like shooting arrows off the horseback when the hooves were off the ground. He starved out Beijing. He used ambushes. He used torture as a weapon, had the soldiers light 5 fires to look like they were a much bigger army than they really were. So there's all sorts of great tactics we've got there. Of course, his motivation was to take down the biggest empire ever. He wanted to rule the world. He never quite gets there, of course. He never actually conquers China, but that is definitely one of his motivations. He unfortunately dies before he's able to do that. So we've got a lot of information we can use to answer this question. That's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something about the Mongols. We'll catch you next time.